Most of what President Trump tried to use to beat on Biden, sort of bounced off, right? Because, I mean, there weren't the obvious negatives that there were with Hillary Clinton, for example. But the one that did stick was Sleepy Joe. The one that did stick was the incoherence. So, you've spent a lot of time with him. Talk about that.
What I find interesting, and I was hearing some of the same kind of reflections from people, also particularly around the world. People, I think in other foreign capitals, I was often getting that question from people, which is how sharp is he? There's a couple of important details I think that are worth pointing out. For one thing, he came into this race out of shape. I mean, he wasn't tuned up as a political figure. He'd spent what can be sort of the most destructive period for a candidate, which is to say he'd spent it in semi-retirement as the boss of bosses, nobody ever cutting him off, nobody ever debating him, nobody ever criticizing him. All of a sudden, he's back into the trenches.
And he lacked discipline in the best of times around that kind of thing, right?
And that's the second piece. That's the key piece of this, is that I think for people who are tuning into Joe Biden now, what they see is a man who, to borrow James Comey's expression, will start a conversation in direction A and end it at direction Z. But what we also know is that if you've been looking at Biden over the long term, 10, 20, 25 years, he has been accused of versions of that forever. That's partly how his mind works. It's partly because he doesn't use a prompter. He doesn't feel comfortable. It goes back to having the stutter. He moves more slowly across the stage. His voice is clearly raspier. But if you listen to his interviews, real interviews, I mean in-depth interviews, what you find is that his mind is unchanged from where it was a few years ago.
Is your sense this is a guy who's thinking this is a one-term thing?
I don't get that sense, actually. And I think part of that is, his political nerve endings tell him that the moment that he signals that this is a one-term thing, that cuts his legs out from under him. All we'll be talking about is who's next. He's sort of, in some sense, it's political malpractice 101 for him to do that. But I also think there's another piece of this. I've talked to him about the decision about when do you retire, when do you hang it up. And his belief is partly rooted in the idea that he looks back on his own father, and he sort of had lobbied his dad to retire, and he thinks that was a mistake. So he kind of pushed him out of it before he should have. And what he says is, look, take a look at me. And if I look like I'm losing a step, then it'll be time to be done.